January 6, 1944. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Major General Jimmy Doolittle stood in the office of Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, when something on the wall caught his attention. A sign hung prominently above Kepner's desk, its message clear and simple. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle read it twice, then turned to Kepner. "That sign needs to come down," he said quietly. "It is wrong." Within hours, a new sign replaced it, the one that would mark a seismic shift in American air strategy. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. What looked like a simple swap of phrasing was, in truth, a declaration of total doctrinal war against the Luftwaffe. Up until this moment, U.S. fighters were little more than bodyguards flying tight defensive formations, chained to the bombers they escorted. They were reactive, predictable, and on the back foot tactically. The Germans knew exactly where they would be and how they would fight. Doolittle just snapped the chain. This single order freed American fighters from escort duty and unleashed them as hunters, not shields. They would no longer wait for German interceptors to attack. They would seek them out first, engage them before they reached the bombers, and eliminate them in the air or on the ground. It was the first crack in what had been the German fighter force's tactical advantage since 1940. That morning signaled the quiet beginning of an offensive air doctrine built on aggression, disruption, and annihilation. And it came from a man who had not come to protect the bomber offensive. He had come to win the air war outright. The Luftwaffe had no idea what was coming. The change Doolittle ordered wasn't just a revision of policy. It was a philosophical detonation. For nearly 2 years, American fighter doctrine had been built on fear. Fear of leaving the bombers, fear of losing formation, fear of failing their escort mission. The RAF, for all its valor in 1940, had helped shape this mindset. Their Battle of Britain experience taught them that preserving aircraft and pilots was the highest priority. They had fought defensively, protecting skies, not breaking the enemy. Doolittle had no interest in fighting a defensive war. He wasn't a bureaucrat. He was a combat pilot. The man who had led the Doolittle raid across an ocean in aircraft not designed to reach their target, knowing most would never come home. He believed in initiative, aggression, and surprise. The Germans were dictating the terms of air combat. Doolittle's mission was to flip the board entirely. But the doctrine shift alone wasn't enough. To implement it, the 8th Air Force needed a new kind of fighter pilot, not a shepherd, but a predator. And to Doolittle's relief, he already had the weapon for it. The P-51 Mustang. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning had carried the air war through 1943 with mixed success. They could fight well, but only within limited range. A fighter that can't stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back can't break an enemy's will. Only inconvenience it. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where they could intercept the bomber streams. At the edge of Allied fighter range, and again on the withdrawal. The Germans weren't chasing the bombers. The bombers were flying into their ambush zone. The Mustang destroyed that geometry. Suddenly, American fighters could go anywhere over occupied Europe, all the way to Berlin, to the oil refineries, to the Luftwaffe's own front yard. But until Doolittle's arrival, they still behaved like escorts. They had a sword, but they used it as a shield. That was what Doolittle was determined to change. He issued orders authorizing free hunting. Fighters would no longer be tied to the bomber box. Instead, they would sweep ahead of the bomber formation, sometimes 30, 60, even 100 miles ahead, flushing German fighters out before they ever reached visual contact with American bombers. If the Luftwaffe scrambled from a base, Mustangs would be waiting above them. If they regrouped and landed to rearm, Mustangs would strafe them on the runway. If German radar saw a bomber formation coming and launched interceptors, the first thing they would meet wouldn't be lumbering B-17s. It would be swarms of P-51s diving out of the sun. The Luftwaffe had spent 4 years controlling when and where to engage. In weeks, they lost both. Doolittle also changed formation doctrine. U.S. pilots were encouraged to break formation aggressively to pursue kills. Initiative was no longer discouraged. It was the expectation. Instead of waiting to be attacked, American pilots manufactured combat. This was exactly the kind of fight the Luftwaffe was poorly positioned to win. Their pilot corps was shrinking in skill and experience. Their training pipeline couldn't produce replacements fast enough. And now, instead of meeting bombers, slow, predictable, and easy to attack, they were forced into turning dogfights with a newer aircraft that could outclimb, outturn, and outrange them. American bomber crews didn't yet understand the full implications of what had just happened. But the German High Command would soon understand it perfectly. They no longer controlled the air above Europe. For the first time since 1939, the hunters were about to become the hunted. To understand why Doolittle's new doctrine hit the Luftwaffe like a hammer, you first have to understand the world before January 1944. A world in which German fighter commands still believed they were the apex predators of the European skies. Up until then, the air war followed a predictable rhythm. The Americans launched bomber streams in daylight. German radar sites picked them up. Intercept groups were scrambled. Bf-109s and FW-190s climbed to altitude, formed attack waves, and dove into the bomber boxes like wolves tearing into a slow, overburdened herd. The U.S. fighter escorts usually arrived with or just behind the bombers, but rarely ahead of them. That meant the Luftwaffe always got the first hit, the element of surprise, and the initiative. Doolittle ripped that playbook in half. Within days of his new directive, Mustang squadrons were flying so aggressively ahead of the bombers that German pilots began radioing in sightings of fighters long before they ever saw a B-17 or B-24. This confused the Luftwaffe command structure. Was it a diversion? A feint? A vanguard of a new bomber wave? By the time they realized these weren't scouting patrols, they were kill sweeps. It was already too late. The first real demonstration came in February 1944, on the missions leading up to Operation Argument, later known as Big Week. Instead of waiting passively to repel attacks, P-51s began loitering above Luftwaffe airfields, attacking interceptors as they took off or climbed to altitude. For German fighter pilots, this was a psychological shock. For years, they had taken off with the security of time, enough to climb, form up, and choose their vector of attack. Now, the moment their wheels left the runway, tracers were already streaking past their canopies. The Americans weren't defending anymore. They were hunting, and the pilots loved it. Many Allied aces later said that Doolittle, with a single doctrinal shift, unleashed the U.S. Fighter Corps. He took the leash off. He replaced passivity with predation. Squadrons that had spent 1943 obeying escort corridors suddenly had the freedom to maneuver, to pursue, to strike first. They weren't shepherds anymore. They were falcons. And the Luftwaffe was not ready for falcons. The results were immediate. German kills began to skyrocket, not just in the air, but on the ground, where P-51s strafed hangars, fuel trucks, service crews, ammunition depots, and planes waiting for repairs. Every destroyed fighter on the ground was a pilot who never got to fly. Every strafing run crippled another sortie before it started. The German pilot training pipeline, already stretched thin, now found itself losing experienced men faster than cadets could replace them. But perhaps the most devastating blow wasn't physical. It was psychological. For the first time since 1940, the Luftwaffe felt hunted. The idea that Allied fighters could simply appear above their own airfields, miles inside Reich territory, shattered the illusion of sanctuary. Aviation historians would later say that February-March 1944 marked not just a tactical shift, but a moment when German morale cracked. Because now the German pilots were no longer fighting to stop the bombers. They were fighting just to survive long enough to reach them, and most never did. By the end of March, one thing was unmistakably clear. The Luftwaffe hadn't merely lost air superiority. They had lost the initiative, the one advantage they had never imagined the Americans would learn to steal from them. By early spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's leadership was scrambling to understand what had happened. From their perspective, nothing about the bombers had changed. The B-17s and B-24s were as slow and heavily armed as ever. What had changed was the sky around them. The Americans were no longer flying layered escort rings. They were spreading upward, outward, forward, like a net closing in from every angle. German intelligence reports from March 1944 described it bluntly. The enemy no longer defends. He hunts. The shock was that this wasn't a technological failure. It was doctrinal. The Luftwaffe didn't lose because the Mustang was a better fighter, but because they were now forced to fight on American terms, not their own. And in air combat, initiative is lethal currency. Doolittle understood something the Germans had forgotten. A fighter that reacts is already losing. The only fighter that wins is the fighter forcing the other side to react. So he ordered something that would have been unthinkable under the previous escort doctrine. Deep penetration fighter sweeps with no bombers in sight. Entire Mustang squadrons flew 50 to 150 miles ahead of bomber formations, not guarding, not waiting, ambushing. They weren't escorts anymore. They were the opening artillery barrage of air combat. And this new doctrine had a multiplier effect the Luftwaffe couldn't match. German fighters took off already under threat. The climb phase, once safe, became a killing ground. Engagements happened before squadron-level coordination. German interceptors fought piecemeal instead of in formation. The Luftwaffe had to burn fuel and manpower chasing ghosts. They never knew when they would hit bombers or Mustangs. Airfield attrition skyrocketed. Every plane destroyed on the ground was a total loss. No bailout, no rescue. Once the Americans owned the airspace, they began attacking the infrastructure that supported it. Fuel depots, maintenance shelters, spare parts convoys, even the oxygen trucks needed for high-altitude flight. Killing a fighter was good. Killing the ability to field fighters was devastating. And at the core of it all was Doolittle's shift in mentality, from preservation to destruction. The Luftwaffe tried countermeasures, close-base fuel staging, low-altitude scrambles, even decoy launches. But every adaptation came with a cost in fuel, time, and pilot stress. The German fighter arm was already losing its veteran core from attrition. Now, inexperienced replacements were flying straight into ambushes they didn't even understand. Meanwhile, the Allied pilots were getting better, not at reacting, but at choosing where the fight happened. This was no longer a contest of machines. It was a contest of initiative, and the Americans had permanently seized it. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, a man who rarely praised his enemies, would later summarize what happened in a single sentence. "We lost the air war the day the fighters stopped waiting for us." That was Doolittle's breakthrough. And the Luftwaffe still hadn't seen his most brutal phase. The part where the Germans weren't just intercepted, they were erased. The tipping point. When the madman proved he was right by the spring of 1944, the debate inside Allied command had turned into a silent war of prediction. Critics inside the RAF still whispered that the Americans' gamble would collapse. The Luftwaffe, they insisted, could not be crushed by flying straight at it. It was too entrenched, too experienced, too protective of the homeland. But Galland and Göring were facing a new reality. The Luftwaffe was being forced to fight every day, whether it was ready or not, because the mad general had engineered a war they couldn't refuse. This is where everything began to flip. The Luftwaffe's fateful choice before his strategy. German pilots had the luxury of choosing when to intercept. Visibility bad? They waited. Allied bomber group too risky? They stayed grounded. Engines or fuel low? They postponed. They dictated the tempo. But once long-range escorts arrived and the deep penetration strategy activated, Doolittle didn't give them that freedom anymore. He brought the war to them, and kept it there. If they didn't take off, American P-51s prowled overhead and destroyed runways, fuel depots, repair hangars, aircraft still on the ground. If they did take off, they flew straight into elite American fighter wings already waiting for them, rested, supplied, and eager. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe had no winning move. The psychological collapse. What most historians miss is that the Luftwaffe didn't just lose aircraft, they lost confidence. German pilots described a shift. Before, we hunted the bombers. Now, we were being hunted. Every engagement became a trap. Every climb to altitude risked never coming home. Junior pilots, many with under 20 flight hours, were fed straight into battles where American aces were flying their fifth sortie of the week. The numbers tell the story. The Luftwaffe wasn't just shrinking. It was being bled from its core outward. And Doolittle knew it. The moment the mad strategy was proven right, it happened over the skies of central Germany during Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, February 1944. For 6 straight days, the Allied bomber stream struck aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and fuel facilities. But the real target was the Luftwaffe itself. Doolittle had turned the entire German air defense network into a self-destructing machine. The RAF looked at the bombing tonnage. The USAF looked at the kill ratios. When the reports came in, the room fell silent. Luftwaffe pilot losses in 1 week. All new pilots produced in 1 month. That was the moment it became mathematically irreversible. From that week forward, Germany could no longer replace its sky veterans. No more training pipeline. No more maturity in the cockpit. No more future. His insane order became strategic doctrine. Before Big Week, Doolittle's idea was a gamble. After Big Week, it became standard doctrine. Even his former critics inside command were forced to admit. The way to defeat the Luftwaffe was not to bomb its factories. It was to kill its pilots, not the hardware, the human edge. And once those pilots were gone, the Luftwaffe wasn't a legendary air force anymore. It was a collection of machines with no one skilled enough to fly them. This was the tipping point. The moment the mad general stopped looking reckless and started looking prophetic. If you want, I'll continue with Module 6, where we cover the collapse from the inside, how Göring lost control, how German aces began to defect psychologically, and why the Luftwaffe's final downfall wasn't physical, it was spiritual and operational. The collapse from within. The day the Luftwaffe knew it was finished, by mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was still flying, but it was no longer fighting. The Air Force that once terrorized Europe from Warsaw to Paris was now in permanent retreat. In the early years of the war, German pilots flew with swagger, the kind born from superiority and inevitability. But by the summer of 1944, something had broken. Not the wings, not the engines, not the fuel lines, the spirit. The silent mutiny Luftwaffe officers didn't mutiny in a cinematic way. No disobedience, no courtroom drama. Their rebellion was psychological. They simply stopped believing. You can fight when you're outnumbered. You can fight when you're outgunned. But you cannot fight when you're already defeated in your head. The German high command still spoke in fantasies. Final victory is certain. New fighters will turn the tide. All we need is one decisive battle. But the pilots in the cockpit knew the truth. The decisive battle had already happened, and they had lost. The pilot crisis turns fatale. Luftwaffe. Ace used to be a man with 400 combat hours before his first major deployment. By 1944, new pilots had less than 30, instructors were being rushed to the front. Trainees were being thrown into formation before they even understood fuel discipline or high-altitude maneuvering. The Americans weren't facing an elite air force anymore. They were facing a conveyor belt of widows in the making. A rookie needed time to become lethal. The mad general's strategy denied them that time. The fuel strangle. The Allied air offensive didn't just kill pilots, it killed petrol. Every refinery from Ploiești to Hamburg was under constant assault. Even when new planes rolled out of the factories, they sat motionless because they had nothing to drink. This created a deadly paradox. Germany had planes it could not fly, and pilots it could not train. Meanwhile, the Americans and British were clocking thousands of training hours, building muscle memory, radar discipline, teamwork, and edge case instincts. The Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was a museum waiting to happen. The fear. Nobody spoke about veteran. Pilots began noticing something chilling. Rookies weren't scared of dying. They were scared of flying. The cockpit had become a tomb with propellers. Every takeoff felt like walking into a wood chipper. This wasn't just defeat. It was internal rot. You can rebuild planes. You can rebuild runways. You cannot rebuild courage once it's drained from the marrow. The Göring disconnect inside. Berlin. Göring was still boasting about revenge formations and next-generation interceptors. He even promised Hitler miracle squadrons that didn't exist. Every speech widened the fracture between command and cockpit. On paper, the Luftwaffe still existed. In reality, it had dissolved, not from bombs, but from truth. There was no fuel, no time, no veterans, no confidence, no future. The once proud Luftwaffe wasn't being defeated anymore. It was bleeding out. The final humiliation, hunted over their own capital. The last psychological collapse came when P-51 Mustangs began circling over Berlin like wolves waiting outside a dying camp. Not over the English Channel, not over France, not even over the front line, over the heart of Germany itself. The message was unspoken but undeniable. You no longer own your own sky. The mad general hadn't just changed tactics, he had changed ownership of the air. Germany would still claim to have fighters in service through 1945, but functionally, the Luftwaffe died the day its pilots realized there was no battle left to win, only a clock slowly counting down. And the world would soon learn that the most devastating defeat in war is not when your machines are destroyed, but when your will to resist evaporates. From escorts to executioners, when Allied fighters stopped defending and started erasing the Luftwaffe by the spring of 1944, the American fighter force in Europe had undergone a fundamental metamorphosis. What began as a protective escort wing designed to shepherd vulnerable bombers became something far more terrifying. A mobile aerial death squad whose mission was simple. Do not protect the bombers. Destroy the Luftwaffe. And the moment this switch flipped, the war in the air changed forever. A sky no longer shared, but owned before Jimmy Doolittle's doctrine shift. Air combat was a kind of ballet. German fighters attacked. Americans defended, and whoever survived limped home. The battlefield was limited to a single narrow corridor around the bomber stream. After the shift, there were no corridors. The battlefield became the entire sky over Germany. American fighters were no longer tied to bomber wings. Instead of circling the formation like guard dogs, they flooded outward like a spearhead, climbing ahead of the bombers, sweeping flanks, ambushing airfields, and intercepting German interceptors before they even reached striking distance. This did not merely defeat the Luftwaffe, it smothered it. The birth of the ranging hunt. This new strategy became known unofficially as free hunting. Fighter wings were given broad authority. If German radar picked you up, you hunt. If a formation was spotted forming, you hunt. If you reached an enemy airfield, you hunt. No request for permission. No waiting for threats. No reactionary posture. American fighters began dictating terms, and German pilots now launched into a fight already losing. Before this shift, German fighters chose when and where to strike. After this shift, American fighters chose if they made it to the fight at all, which meant increasingly, they didn't. The new terror. Fighter sweep tactics. The most devastating change came from altitude strategy. Instead of sticking at bomber height, American fighters began flying, higher, faster, earlier. They waited above the German climb path, not behind the bombers. So when the Luftwaffe took off, climbing slowly and guzzling precious fuel, American Mustangs and Thunderbolts dove onto them like hawks hitting pigeons. A German pilot now died before he ever reached combat altitude. The Luftwaffe wasn't being outfought. It was being denied the ability to fight at all. No safe haven. Not even on the ground. Once command realized interception waves were collapsing, they doubled down. American fighters were greenlit to attack airfields directly. What had once been unthinkable, fighters strafing hardened runways deep in Germany, was now standard procedure. Parked aircraft became target practice. Refueling crews died beside their tools. Fresh recruits burned alive before logging a single kill. This was no longer air superiority. This was air domination. The strategy becomes a machine. Once the system was in motion, nothing could stop it. Bombers drew radar and early warning. Attention! American fighters detached and fanned. Outward, Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept bombers. They never reached them. Every mission delivered a double blow. Industrial damage from bombers, pilot attrition from fighters. Germany could replace factories. It could even replace airframes. But it could not replace time, and it could not replace experience. Once those vanished, the war was already over. The moment the Allies owned the war by late 1944, one truth was obvious to every surviving German pilot. The Americans no longer visited German skies. They possessed them. The Luftwaffe was no longer defending Germany. It was trespassing in its own airspace. And air forces that trespass on their own soil are not air forces anymore. They are ghosts collecting their final daylight. The moment of no return. When the Luftwaffe began dying faster than it could fight by March 1944, the Luftwaffe wasn't just losing air battles. It was losing the ability to participate in them. The critical shift was no longer measured in aircraft production or operational plans, but in something far more irreplaceable: pilots. Factories could stamp out new fighters, but it took years to produce an ace, and the Americans were now killing them by the dozen in single missions. The death spiral had begun, and there was no pulling out of it. Contrary to popular myth, the Luftwaffe didn't collapse because it lacked planes. In fact, by mid-1944, Germany was producing more aircraft than in any previous year of the war. But the cockpits were increasingly filled by 19-year-olds with only a few dozen flight hours and virtually no combat seasoning. These were not successors to Galland or Mulders or Marseille. These were barely trained boys strapped to exploding aluminum coffins. The pilot schools had been gutted. Before 1944, German cadets logged up to 240 flying hours before entering combat. By late 1944, that number had dropped to 110, then 80, then, in many cases, under 50. Some were being sent to the front after only 10 hours of time in their actual operational aircraft. Meanwhile, American pilots arriving in England often had over 300 flight hours, months of live instructor combat training, and the advantage of fuel, weather, and strategic predictability. But training hours were only half the disaster. The conditions those rookie Germans flew into were essentially engineered killing zones. In every direction, Allied fighters were patrolling like sharks circling a reef. Even if a rookie Luftwaffe pilot avoided being shot down, he was often forced down early by fuel shortages. The new German fighters, like the FW-190A8, had powerful armament and great climb rate, but guzzled fuel so rapidly that a single dogfight could leave them unable to return to base if it dragged on. Many simply vanished into forests or fields when tanks ran dry. Doolittle's doctrine ensured they almost never got a second chance. A pilot with 40 hours of experience was now facing a Mustang pilot with $400, and the Mustang pilot was hunting him before he had even reached altitude or formed up with his squadron. That wasn't a contest, it was an execution. Another hidden killer was time. Before the shift in U.S. doctrine, German pilots could rest, repair their planes, rotate units, study bomber tactics. But once the skies became permanently contested, they were constantly scrambling, constantly reacting, and constantly exhausted. Logistically, there was no breathing room. Strategically, there was no defensive perimeter left. Operationally, every day thinned the ranks further. And this is the critical point. Once the Luftwaffe lost its core of veteran instructors, its training engine collapsed behind it. A school can rebuild a plane. It cannot rebuild a legacy of knowledge that took a decade to accumulate. Germany could still build airframes, machine guns, engines, but it could no longer build fighters in the true sense of the word. Trained, battle-proven aviators. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe still looked large on paper. Hundreds of aircraft were assigned to units across the Reich, but on most days, fewer than 20% of them actually made it into the air. They had fuel shortages, crews shortages, nerve shortages, and above all, survivor shortages. This was the moment of no return. Not a dramatic last battle or a single critical defeat, but a slow statistical suffocation. A war of aviation mathematics that Germany could never win. The Allies didn't merely shoot down a force, they erased a generation of knowledge. And once that happened, the Luftwaffe was no longer an air force. It was a ceremonial list of tail numbers waiting for their turn to burn. Black Thursday for the Luftwaffe. When the hunters became the hunted by April 1944, the strategic reality was unmistakable. The Luftwaffe no longer dictated the tempo of air combat. It reacted to American raids rather than shaping them. But the true breaking point, the moment when Germany's air arm ceased to function as a strategic force, came not over Berlin or the Ruhr, but over a quiet patch of southern Germany on a spring afternoon. It happened on April 24, 1944, a day most historians now refer to as the Pilot Massacre, when an entire wave of elite German fighter units was ambushed before they could even form up into combat groups. The mission had been textbook Luftwaffe tactics. Intercept the bombers before they could reach their target, smash into the formation head-on, force the B-17s to scatter or jettison bombs prematurely. It was a method that had once worked against RAF raids. But this time, before the interceptors could gain altitude, the Mustangs were already waiting above them, throttles closed, invisible in the glare until it was too late. Instead of German fighters diving through the American formation, American fighters dove onto the Luftwaffe while they were still climbing, out of position, low on speed, and defenseless. In less than 11 minutes, 38 German fighters were shot down. Not from a prolonged dogfight, but from ambush, before the Luftwaffe pilots even saw the bombers they had been scrambled to defend against. When the surviving German pilots landed, many were visibly shaken. Some refused to exit their cockpits for several minutes. Others sat motionless on the tarmac, staring ahead in disbelief. One mechanic later recorded, "They looked like men who had seen the ending of the war arrive in front of their eyes." And in a strategic sense, they had. Because after that day, something broke inside German fighter command. They no longer believed victory was even possible. Mission orders were still given. Pilots were still scrambled. But the initiative, the spirit of air superiority, was gone. This is when fear became a permanent passenger in every cockpit. Veteran pilots who once lectured rookies about aggression and honor were now telling them to avoid contact when outnumbered. Others quietly advised younger flyers to live long enough to fight again, meaning, do not die for nothing. On paper, it sounded like prudence. In practice, it was the psychological surrender of the Luftwaffe's offensive identity. Meanwhile, for American fighter pilots, the war had turned into what they grimly called harvesting season. They were no longer escorting bombers and hoping to find the enemy. They were hunting the enemy as a primary mission, and something even more devastating was now happening behind the scenes. German aircraft were being destroyed before they ever took off. Mustang sweeps were striking airfields, catching fighters on runways, blasting parked planes before they could even taxi. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing pilots, it was losing the ability to launch. Fuel was rationed to such extremes that some interceptor wings got only 20 minutes of flight time per week. New aircraft sat in hangars unused because there was no gas to train the men who would fly them. This paradox defined the late-war Luftwaffe. Plane-rich, pilot-poor, fuel-starved, and strategically blind. By the summer of 1944, air superiority over Germany was not contested. It was over. The Luftwaffe still existed administratively, but as a functional force, it had bled out, not in one dramatic battle, but through relentless attrition. The Americans didn't just defeat German aviation. They cornered it, starved it, exhausted it, and finally erased its ability to regenerate. What came next, the final collapse, would be unlike anything seen before in modern warfare. An air force that still had planes on the ground, but no pilots left to fly them. The day the Luftwaffe died. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe still existed on paper. There were still squadrons assigned to sectors, staff officers writing orders, and factories producing fighters that technically entered service. But in the skies, Germany no longer had an air force, only scattered remnants trying to survive each sunrise. The final collapse wasn't a dramatic last stand. It was a slow suffocation. Fuel shortages had reached absurd levels. Some pilots were allotted one practice takeoff and landing per month. Replacement pilots sometimes flew their first combat mission on the same day they touched a fighter for the first time. Many died before clearing the runway, and hovering above them every morning were the P-51s, circling like wolves waiting for movement. The moment that symbolized the Luftwaffe's death came on March 31st, 1945. When an American fighter sweep reported 0 German aircraft attempting interception, not because they failed to scramble, but because there was simply no one left to climb into the cockpits. Dozens of brand new 109s and 190s sat silently on dispersal pads, perfect targets for strafing runs. The Americans didn't have to defeat them in battle, they just burned them where they stood. For the first time since its creation, the German Air Force did not contest incoming bombers over its own homeland. The skies over the Reich were no longer a battlefield, they were a corridor. Doolittle's doctrine had done exactly what it was designed to do. Not just protect American bombers, but annihilate the ability of Germany to resist by destroying its pilots, its morale, and finally, its future. The Luftwaffe didn't lose the war in one dogfight. It simply ran out of men still alive to fight it.